This is February the 4th, the year 2000. My name is Clarence Bell. I was born Clarence Beliel. Bell is spelled B-E-L-L and Beliel is spelled B-E-L-I-E-L. My story starts with my father, who was in the U.S. Marine Corps, stationed in Shanghai, China, back in the early 30s, maybe the late 20s, I think perhaps the late 20s. My mother was a Russian refugee from the Communist Revolution, a so-called Menshevik, if that means anything to you. To historians of the Russian Revolution, it means quite a bit. They were opposed to the Bolshevik system and therefore had to flee for their lives, and they went to Asia, to Shanghai. My father met my mother there. They were married. I was born there. When it came time for him to re-enlist, he chose not to do so. He chose to be discharged in Shanghai, where his new family was. And so I was born there, and I have a younger brother who was born there. I was born in 1931. My father was a very intelligent and really gifted individual. And he went to work for the newspaper in Shanghai, whose name I don't recall. But in very short order, he went into the news department and into the advertising department and rose to a position of some responsibility for the newspaper. At the same time, things were getting a little difficult in China. The Japanese were coming in. The Sino-Japanese War had started, and so he decided to move his family to Manila. He secured a spot as advertising manager for a department store in Manila, which also owned a radio station, which I believe at that time was called KZRH. In the paper here I see it is D, as in dog, ZRH. I don't know whether the call letters have been changed by international agreement since that time or not, but I believe he worked for KZRH. He also secured for himself the spot of NBC correspondent for the Far East, so he had a dual job, maybe even a triple job. Let's say a dual job. He was the advertising manager for a department store, and he was a local newsman. He gave news analysis every night on local radio and was NBC's correspondent in the Far East. He operated under the name of Don Bell, even though he was born Clarence Beliel, because Don Bell seemed like a much nicer name for a radio personality. And at that time in our history, it was common to adopt pseudonyms for purposes like that. Today we have strange names for our various movie actors and we think that's quite all right, but in those days it was not. So professionally he became Don Bell. And we also took the name of Bell because, again, at that time it was quite embarrassing for Mrs. Beliel to be living with Mr. Bell. So that was very easy for us to do. Well, along came the war. Let me back up a little bit. We moved to Manila in 1939 and were in Manila for 3 years prior to the war breaking out. When the war broke out, my father, along with a large number of Americans, upon orders of the Japanese, surrendered to the Japanese at the Manila Hotel in the early days of January 1942. My mother, being a Russian citizen more or less, although the government that she had citizenship with was no longer in existence, chose to call us Russians also, and we stayed out for a period of maybe 2 months through January and February, and we had nothing. The banks were inaccessible. She had a lot of fear that they were going to discover that she had American children and the consequences could be tragic. So eventually, after a couple of months, she decided it was best to claim she was American, turn herself in, turn us in, and be under the direction of the Japanese. At that time, it didn't seem that it was going to be quite so bad as it had a couple of months earlier. So my parents chose to put my brother and I in a Roman Catholic convent called Holy Ghost, which had a number of children of our age that they looked after. I would estimate in the range of 50 to 75 or so children about our age and younger who were at Holy Ghost. And we stayed there for perhaps 2 or 3 months. I think finishing up the school year and going into the summer. And then we moved back to Santo Tomas, my brother and I, to be with our parents. At Santo Tomas, the men and women were separated. They didn't live as a family unit. Most of the people, most of the families, when they could, would try to erect some sort of a lean-to or shed or something like that, which they called their shanty. And at least for the first couple of years, they could not sleep there, but they gathered there to live somewhat as a family, to eat together, and so on. We had a shanty, which was on the opposite the east wall of the main building. There was a wall which separated a portion of Santo Tomas where the internees were from another portion where the priests and brothers were who had been administering the university prior to the war. It was, of course, a Catholic university. And the priests were segregated from us. The Japanese could do anything they wanted to, and so they did this, and they had a wall internally in the camp which separated the internees from the priests. We had our shanty along that wall. It didn't have any sides, it just had a roof and a little bit of furniture, some cabinets where we kept some dishes and so on. Next to our shanty on both directions were others that were just like ours. We met there to eat and to socialize and so on, but we stayed in our own places. Now, my father, since he was a newscaster prior to the war, assumed the responsibility in the camp of being the newscaster in the camp. So he ran the public address system. Every day, every evening, he would give a 10-15 minute news show concerning miscellaneous items of gossip, anything that the Japanese needed to have announced, whatever news there might have been that was of a tame nature. Of course, there was no national news of any sort, no news about the war, nothing like that was allowed. We were not supposed to know anything about it. Now, there were a few individuals in the camp who together did manage to hide a shortwave radio. And my father was involved with this. I don't know whether he was the instigator of the radio and its hiding or just one of the participants, but they did have news of what was going on in the world, and so our family knew a little something about what was going on, and to the extent my father could, he would try to sneak in a little bit of information here and there about what was going on with the war. I think his most famous phrase came when the American forces were coming back and the Battle of Leyte had occurred and General MacArthur had landed on the Isle of Leyte. And in the course of giving some sort of news about something or other, he concluded by saying, "Better Leyte than never." The internees, who were quite attuned to trying to get second meaning out of what was said because of the situation, immediately understood that the end was not very far off. American forces were back on the islands, and the Japanese, who weren't quite so versed with our colloquialism, just were not aware of that. I might also say that my father had a very dangerous time in the camp. The Japanese were continually, let me back up, not continually, but at the beginning they were actively looking for Don Bell. They had heard that he was in the camp and were trying to find him. They had some people who knew who he was, some Japanese people, and they actually one day went through the camp looking for him with these people. Because we knew that this was happening, he was quickly rushed to the hospital. His face was wrapped in bandages. He was laid on a bed. As I recall it, he had his arm wrapped up and it was in a sling, and he was supposed to have been very severely burned, so they couldn't see his face. He escaped detection in any event and stayed in the camp under his born name, Clarence Beliel, and I was Clarence Beliel Jr., as my brother was Richard Beliel and my mother was Lilia Beliel. We existed very well under that name and managed to survive our whole internment without him being detected.
Clarence, could you describe a family life, typical family life in camp for the Beliel family?
Certainly. We met at our shanty for meals. As I recall it, there was some breakfast served and one other meal during the day. So at least twice a day we would meet and sit around for an hour and a half, maybe eating a little. It didn't take long to finish the food, but we would talk a little. A couple of times a day, and then we would go our separate ways. My father would go back to his work. My mother, I can't recall what she did in the camp, but it was not a very important job as my father's was. I think maybe she helped out at the hospital as an orderly, as a helper. My brother and I lived in separate facilities from our parents, of course. And our day was filled with doing very little of anything. There were athletic activities which were sponsored at the camp. I remember playing softball. I did some boxing, believe it or not, even though we didn't have much to eat. We played a little basketball. So we had a lot of fun doing that. I read a lot. Santo Tomas, being a university, had quite a good library. And I think there was a period of time there where I was knocking off about a book a day. Just learned to read very rapidly. I had a lot of practice at it, and there were lots of interesting things to read about. So from that point of view, my education went fairly well, even though there was little formal education. Roughly speaking, that's the way our family life went. Of course, in the evening, well, generally in the evening, we would gather also at the shanty for maybe an hour or so. And then my dad would go on and give the news, and about that time, the curfew would kick in, and we'd all go to our separate places. Let me describe a little about what the situation in the camp was in the last days of the camp. A few days prior to our liberation, actually, maybe a week or 10 days prior to our liberation, things became very tense. We had almost nothing to eat. The attitude of the Japanese changed. They were very edgy, our guards, and it was just apparent that things weren't going right. And then some bombing started. We could see the American airplanes dive bombing. The sky was filled with tracer bullets and exploding shells, and was just a spectacular fireworks display, except this was for real. 2 or 3 days before our liberation, the Japanese guards, for some reason or other, all marched out of the camp, left us totally alone. So we no longer were guarded. We were, in a sense, free. Except that there really wasn't much for us to do. The city was full of Japanese soldiers. It would have been very difficult for us to try to escape anywhere, so we just stayed. A day or so later, in they came again. I don't know what the nature of their mix-up was, but they left and came back. As the final day or two approached, the bombing became more frequent. And on the evening of February the 3rd of 1945, we had a particularly spectacular show at night. The skies were full of exploding shells, tracer bullets. Earlier, when it was light, you could see the dive bombers. At night, it was just a spectacular show. It was very clear that something was happening. Now, as I understand it, and I can't speak from a position of authority now, these are the stories that I heard. I was just a child. I was 10 years old at the time. It is my understanding that the Japanese had come to the decision that they were going to get rid of the adult males, age 12 and older, and use the women and children as hostages. And it is also my understanding that this information was known to the American forces through, I believe, a spy, either a British or an American intelligence officer, had penetrated the camp and spent a day or so in the camp pretending to be an internee, and gave us some news, we gave him some news, and then he managed to make it out of the camp. So it was pretty well known by my father and others who knew about these things that we were approaching a very dangerous time. So when the action occurred on February 3rd, it was really very welcome. We didn't know whether we were going to escape successfully or not, but at least things were in our favor in the sense that the Americans were very close. Then late that evening, I would estimate maybe 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock that night, a tank crashed through the gate, came into the camp. I recall by the time I saw it that it was covered with civilians who had jumped on it. There were other tanks that came through. The Japanese guards had all gone into the educational building together with some Americans who were there, some prisoners, and held those Americans as hostages. I recall very clearly that one of the guards, a particularly disliked fellow, I remember very clearly his body being dragged on the concrete outside the main building and people yelling and jeering at him. I think he was not alive at that time, but I'm not sure. It was a very traumatic time. It was filled with the terror, with uncertainty, and finally with jubilation beyond description when those tanks finally came in. Now, after the liberation, my father, because of his news background, was immediately offered several jobs. All of the news organizations wanted to hire him so he could tell his story and continue covering the war. He hired on with the Mutual broadcasting system, which was one of the big three, I believe it was at that time, NBC, CBS, and Mutual. I'm not sure whether ABC was in existence then or not. In any event, he went to work for the Mutual Broadcasting Company. He immediately took off, started covering the war in China. He was shot down in an airplane on the Chinese mainland and managed, together with a few other people, to walk to safety. In the meantime, we stayed in the camp and awaited his return. And we left the camp, I would say, in about June of 1945. Went to San Francisco first on a troop ship whose name I can't recall. Went to my dad's hometown of Hutchinson, Kansas, and stayed there for just a short while. He still had his job with Mutual, and we then moved to New York City, where he continued in the broadcast business. After a year or so, he took a job with a radio station in Washington, D.C. as their news director. So we moved to Washington, D.C. I graduated. No, I didn't. I did not graduate from high school there. He decided he wanted to go back to his hometown of Hutchinson, Kansas. Had no problems getting a job there as news director of a radio station there. We moved there. Things went along fairly well for us, but for my parents, not so well. They finally separated in perhaps 1950 or so. He moved on to Florida, where he continued his news activities, primarily publishing his own publication, the Don Bell Reports. We continued with our mother, my brother and I. I've seen my father just a few times over the years. He is still alive in West Palm Beach, Florida. He must be I'm going to guess 91 or 92 years old. But we're not in everyday contact with him. In my case, I went on and led my life. I was really too young to establish contact with most of the other 13, 14-year-old kids who were my age. My parents weren't particularly active in trying to keep in contact with internee affairs. I went on, did my thing, got married, had a couple of kids. I have my PhD in mechanical engineering. I've been a university professor. I have been with the Johnson Space Center at NASA, where I finally retired, heading the robotic laboratories at the Johnson Space Center. And as I got older and as I retired, I began to reflect on my life and what it meant. And it became more and more important for me to try to go back and see Manila again, see Santo Tomas again, possibly get in contact with some of the people who, like me, had survived those times. It's an emotional thing, I suppose, as one reflects on one's life and what little may lie ahead. Those sorts of sentimental and nostalgic things become more important. And that really is so in my case. And that is why I'm back here. And it's been an emotional experience for me. I've enjoyed it very much also. And it's meant some closure to me, and I do appreciate that, and I'm glad I did it.